History remembers wars by their battles, empires by their flags, and presidents by their speeches. But it almost never remembers the men who whispered in corridors, forged documents by candlelight, buried truths under oceans of paperwork, quietly changed the destiny of a nation without ever firing a gun. This is the true story of one such shadow. Story so unsettling that parts of it were classified for decades. A story stitched together from court transcripts, private letters, forgotten newspaper clippings, Senate hearings, and the testimony of people who were warned explicitly not to speak. If America is a house, this story lives in its basement. Deamara looked AWAY 1871 on the morning of October 9th, 1871. Chicago smelled like ash and ambition. The Great Fire had not yet finished its work, but the city already understood that something irreversible was happening. Wind howled down wooden streets like a living thing, feeding on pine beams and fresh paint. Bells rang until their towers collapsed. Horses screamed. Men ran carrying ledgers instead of children. By dawn, over 3 square miles of the city were gone. What history books will tell you is that this fire Chicago forced it to rebuild in steel, modernize its infrastructure, and rise into the industrial giant it would soon become. What they rarely mention is what disappeared with the flames. Entire court records, land deeds, bank ledgers, immigration files, police registries, lives on papers simply ceased to exist, and in the smoke-choked chaos, a 22-year-old clerk named Elias Warren Blackwood stood on the west bank of the Chicago River, watching documents float like burned birds across the water. He did not cry. He did not run. He smiled because Elias understood something that most people did not. America was not built only by pioneers and presidents. It was built by gaps. Elias Blackwood had been born nobody special in 1849 in a collapsing Ohio River town that had already peaked before he learned to walk. His father died young officially from a factory accident, unofficially from knowing the wrong thing about the wrong shipment of iron. His mother raised him on silence. "Listen more than you speak," she used to say. "Write nothing you can remember. Remember nothing you can deny." By 16, Elias could copy handwriting so precisely that even the original author could not tell the difference. By 18, he could recite entire legal codes from memory, not because he respected them, but because he understood how fragile they were. The law, he learned, was not a wall, it was a suggestion. So when the fire erased half of Chicago's bureaucratic memory, Elias did not see tragedy. He saw opportunity. By the winter of 1872, Chicago was desperate for clerksmen who could rebuild records from fragments, affidavits, and sworn statements. Elias applied under a slightly altered name, using a baptismal record salvaged from a church that had burned down but whose priest had survived. No one checked too carefully, no one ever did. In those days, within a year, Elias had access to reconstructed property titles, insurance claims, inheritance disputes, and immigration affidavits. A story trying to reassemble itself from smoke. He noticed patterns others ignored: a widow whose husband never existed on paper, a factory that changed owners without a sale, A man who arrived from Europe 3 times under 3 spellings. America, Elias realized, was full of legal ghosts, and ghosts could be controlled. The first time Elias altered history, it was small, a single line in a land registry adjusting a boundary by 12 feet. The property owner never noticed. The city never questioned it. But when a rail spur was later planned, that 12 feet determined which man became wealthy overnight. Elias watched from his office window as men shook hands over fortunes they did not know he had decided. It felt intoxicating. By 1876, Elias was no longer merely correcting records. He was shaping them. He learned which judges drank too much, which aldermen owed gambling debts, which businessmen needed paperwork to match their ambitions. He never asked for bribes. He asked for favors. In 1881, a U.S. senator from Illinois, his name still redacted in several archives, requested a private meeting with a records specialist recommended by 3 different people who had never met each other. Elias arrived precisely on time. The senator needed proof that a rival had falsified citizenship papers 20 years earlier. Elias could produce that proof or erase it that night. Elias Blackwood stepped beyond city influence and into national gravity. He would later describe that moment in a private notebook found after his death. Power is not the ability to act. Power is the ability to decide which version of the past survives. By the time the Statue of Liberty was unveiled in 1886, Elias had quietly assisted in rewriting the documented origins of dozens of powerful Americans, financiersmen whose public biographies would later be taught in schools, not by inventing lies, by choosing which truths remained visible. Ellis Island records could be amended. Census data could be corrected. Court transcripts could be summarized selectively. History, Elias learned, was less about facts and more about filing systems. In 1893, when Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, the White City America celebrated progress, electricity, order, and the triumph of civilization. Visitors saw gleaming buildings and symmetrical streets. Elias saw something else entirely, a nation drunk on its own reflection, and he understood a dangerous truth. When people believe the future is bright, they stop questioning the past. That was when Elias began his most ambitious project that would eventually reach the White House, a project that would outlive him, a project so deeply embedded in American institutions that dismantling it would take generations and leave scars. Historians still argue about today. He called it only in his private notes the shadow archive. The archive that should not exist 1887 to 1898. By 1887, Elias Warren Blackwood no longer thought of himself as a clerk. Clerks followed rules. Clerks waited for instructions. Clerks believed the paperwork described reality. Elias knew better. Paperwork created reality. He had moved his residence to a modest brick building on South Dearborn Street, unremarkable from the outside, deliberately forgettable. Inside, the rooms were narrow and dim, lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets salvaged from burned courthouses, defunct law firms, and bankrupt banks. Each bore no label. Only Elias knew the logic, not alphabetical. not chronological, not geographic. He organized documents by leverage the shadow. Archive began as a personal system, a way to cross-reference land deeds with immigration manifests, insurance claims with police reports, Senate votes with bank loans. Patterns emerged. Men who publicly opposed monopolies while privately holding railroad stock. Judges who ruled harshly against labor unions after receiving mortgages from industrial trusts. Congressmen who suddenly softened their stance on immigration once their own origins grew flexible. Elias never destroyed originals unless necessary. He duplicated, annotated, and quietly redirected. Copies went where they mattered. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Publicly, it was meant to curb monopolies. Privately, Elias understood it was a weapon, one that could be aimed selectively within months. He received a sealed envelope bearing a federal seal and no return address. Inside was a single sentence. Typed, "We are told you know where the bones are buried." Elias smiled. The meeting took place in Washington, D.C., in a townhouse that officially belonged to a widowed philanthropist who had not been seen in public for nearly a year. There were 5 men in the room: a railroad executive, a steel magnate, a senior Treasury official, a newspaper publisher, and a man who did not introduce himself at all. They did not threaten Elias. They offered him protection. In exchange, they wanted something simple: guidance. Which companies were vulnerable? Which politicians could be pressured? Which scandals were reland? Which were rumors? Elias did not answer immediately. He asked for time. That night, alone in his rented room, Elias opened a notebook he never allowed himself to reread too often. The danger is not being discovered. The danger is becoming useful. He knew the line he was approaching, but he also knew America had already crossed it by 1892. Elias had become an unofficial consultant to men who would later be described as captains of industry. His advice was never written, never signed, never acknowledged. He would say things like, "Your rival's incorporation papers from 1868 were filed under an alternate spelling," or "The judge overseeing your case was naturalized in a county whose records no longer exist." He never told them what to do. He let them draw conclusions. The Homestead Strike of 1892 shocked the nation's steelworkers, clashing violently with private security. Blood spilled over wages and dignity. Newspapers framed it as chaos. Elias saw it as coordination failure. He possessed documents never published that showed foreknowledge among corporate executives, private militias, and local officials. The strike was not inevitable. It was allowed. And Elias had chosen not to interfere. That realization unsettled him more than he expected. In 1894, during the Pullman strike, Elias was asked the first time to suppress information. Railroad records showing coordinated price manipulation. Telegrams revealing prearranged federal intervention. He hesitated. Then he complied. That was the night Elias crossed from observer to participant. By the mid-1890s. The shadow archive had grown beyond Chicago. Satellite caches existed in St. Louis, New York, Boston, and San Francisco, each maintained by men who did not know Elias's full name and never met each other. Redundancy was survival. One cache was hidden beneath a Lutheran church basement, accessible only by moving a baptismal ponto. Another was sealed inside a defunct mining shaft in Nevada, cataloged as collapsed and unsafe. If one archive burned, another would remain. History could survive partial amputation. In 1896, William McKinley ran for president. The election was framed as a battle over gold versus silver, stability versus populism. What the public did not see was the quiet war over records. Citizenship challenges, voter eligibility lists, campaign finance disclosures that could disappear or resurface. Elias never supported McKinley openly, but he ensured certain truths remained buried long enough for the votes to be counted. On September 14, 1901, President McKinley was assassinated. The nation mourned. Elias Reed, every report, every transcript, every investigation summary. He noticed inconsistencies immediately. Not proof of conspiracy, proof of haste. America wanted closure more than accuracy. Files were sealed. The questions went quiet, and Theodore Roosevelt became president. That same week, Elias received another envelope. No seal this time. Inside was a simple card. "We will need you." Signed only with initials. T.R. Elias stared at the card for a long time. He had always believed he was operating in the margins. Now, the center was calling. He traveled to Washington under an assumed Purpose Records consultation and entered a world of leather chairs, whispered deals, and men who believed history bent naturally toward them. Roosevelt was not afraid of Elias. That surprised him. Roosevelt understood power instinctively. He knew corruption existed, but he believed it could be mastered, directed, used. The two men spoke only twice, once in person, once through intermediaries. Elias was asked to verify genealogies, financial disclosures, and past affiliations of political enemies. He complied selectively. He admired Roosevelt. That frightened him. By 1904, Elias was tired. He had shaped outcomes, protected some men, ruined others, and watched as America accelerated into a new century of steel, oil, and global ambition. The shadow archive had become too large for one man. Too dangerous. Too essential. Elias began to plan an exit, but history does not release its servants easily. In 1906, a young investigative journalist from New York began asking questions. About missing court files, about altered census records, about why certain scandals collapsed. Without explanation. Her name was Margaret Hawley. And for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The woman who read between the lines 1906-1912, Margaret Hawley, did not look like trouble. That, Elias would later admit, was the most dangerous thing about her. She wore practical dresses, kept her hair pinned neatly, and spoke with the careful politeness expected of a woman in early 20th century America who wished to be taken seriously, and not too seriously at the same time. She worked for a New York paper that specialized in municipal corruption. Nothing glamorous, no war reporting, no front page bylines most days, but Margaret had a habit editors found inconvenient. She read appendices. Her investigation began, as so many dangerous ones do, with a footnote, a routine article about slum housing in Lower Manhattan referenced a property trust that technically did not exist before 1893, yet appeared in court cases from the 1880s. Margaret noticed the inconsistency. She pulled the files. They didn't match. A deed referenced a census entry that had been corrected in 1902. A court transcript cited testimony from a witness who had died in 1891. An immigration record listed an arrival ship that had never docked in New York. Individually, these were errors. Together, they formed a pattern. Margaret began to map discrepancies the way other reporters mapped bribes. She pinned documents to her apartment wall, used colored thread to connect names, addresses, dates. What emerged was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something colder, an infrastructure. Someone, perhaps several, someone's had been editing the American record, quietly, systematically. By 1907, Margaret was traveling Chicago, St. Louis, Boston. She interviewed clerks, retired judges, widows, archivists, anyone who remembered how things used to be filed, stored, categorized. Most dismissed her. A few grew nervous. One old court stenographer in Illinois, half-blind and nearly deaf, gripped Margaret's wrist during an interview and whispered, "Some papers were never meant to be found together." Elias learned of her through an intermediary. The warning was vague. A woman is asking questions. That should not have worried him. People ask questions all the time. What unsettled him was the type of questions. Margaret was not hunting scandals, was hunting structure. He obtained one of her published articles, read it twice, then a third time. She never accused, never speculated openly. She let contradictions speak. Elias recognized the method. It was his own. In 1908, Margaret requested access to a sealed archive in Cook County, citing a public interest exemption rarely granted. The request crossed Elias' desk under a different heading. He could have denied it. He did not. He altered the index instead. Margaret would find something just, not everything. He told himself this was mercy. The election of 1908 brought William Howard Taft to the presidency. Progressivism surged. Trust-busting became fashionable. For the first time, men Elias had once protected were nervous. They wanted reassurance. Elias gave none. He was watching Margaret. Now, Margaret's breakthrough came in 1909 in a place no one else bothered to look. A church basement in rural Ohio. The congregation had closed years earlier. The building was being sold. Old furniture and boxers were to be discarded. Margaret was there chasing a housing story. She opened a crate marked simply, "Record,"